Somewhere between Majora's Mask and The Wind Waker, a couple of fantastic little Zelda titles, developed by Capcom of all companies, would end up taking shape on the Game Boy Color. These two games would end up hitting store shelves as a dual release, two sister games that would be intrinsically connected to form one larger Zelda experience. This is the Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages, a pair of frankly incredible Zelda games with a run of 19 story dungeons between them. It would be easy to look at these similar color-coded box arts and titles and assume that this was the Zelda series following suit after the success of Pokémon. However, Pokémon's dual releases are two versions of the same game. That is not the case here. These are two unique Zelda titles, each comparable in length to Link's Awakening. They feature entirely different stories, villains, overworld settings, dungeons, items, characters, and even gameplay philosophies, with Seasons having more of an action focus, while Ages maintains an emphasis on puzzles. They are connected, but entirely separate beasts. I can't stress this enough. These are just two entire, complete games. Their connectivity is what sets them apart, however. The idea was to play one after the other, in the order of your choosing. After the end of your first adventure, you would receive a password to input at the start of the next, allowing certain elements to carry over to whichever adventure you tackled second, ultimately leading you to the duology's true ending. So I know I just said these were two independent Zelda titles, but they are best enjoyed as two halves of a larger experience, whereas their Pokémon contemporaries will offer a pretty complete experience with just one or the other version. You only need Pokémon Red or Blue, but you will definitely want to enjoy both Ages and Seasons. Hopefully I'm making sense. Now, with all of that context, I wanted to address the order in which I am choosing to cover these two games and their dungeons for this series. I am choosing to complete Oracle of Seasons first, followed by Oracle of Ages. While I've heard that the opposite order offers more story closure for side quests, well, this isn't a lore video. It is a level design analysis video, and when looking at the two games as a larger whole, it is important to me that I take the overall difficulty curve into account. To put it bluntly, Oracle of Ages is a significantly more difficult game than Seasons, which is probably why I prefer Ages between the two. So while you can play them in either order, I think it makes the most sense from a dungeon design dissection standpoint to look at the easier Seasons first. I'll refer you to this great video by my pal Nehru for a little more on that subject. He explains it pretty in depth, but my own reasoning for this series can be summed up by this graph he made about the difficulty of these games' dungeons. Though on a more personal note, in my own previous playthroughs of these games, I have only ever played Ages then Seasons, so doing this order of Seasons first, then Ages is a nice little excuse for me to try something a little different on this playthrough. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's hop into things. Beckoned by the Triforce, Link finds himself thrown into the land of Holodrum. After being rescued by the dancer Din and her troupe, danger follows closely behind our hero. General Onyx appears, swatting the troupe and Link aside before capturing Din, who is the titular Oracle of Seasons. With the Oracle imprisoned and her temple buried, Holodrum's seasons are thrown into chaos. After arming himself, Link consults the wise Maku Tree, who tasks him with tracking down the 8 essences of nature, the closest of which is found in a gnarled root just north of Horon Village. The Maku Tree gives Link the key to this all too familiar entrance, unlocking the first dungeon. Welcome to the Gnarled Root Dungeon, which finds itself in a bit of an interesting, if not difficult, position. It has to strike a balance between being this game's first full dungeon, while also maybe being the 10th dungeon that you complete in the game's duology after you've already got the likes of the notorious Jabu Jabu under your belt. Gnarled Root has to straddle the line between being simple enough to be a starter dungeon, but also engaging enough for players to continue on the path that they may have left off with after ages. And I'm happy to report that it pulls this off with at least relative success. One way this is achieved is by supplementing some of the game's tutorialization with the Hero's Cave. If you take on Seasons first, then the Hero's Cave will offer you a short mini-dungeon that teaches you the very basics of the dungeon crawling experience before you set foot in this place, solving very basic puzzles to unlock shutter doors and spawn a treasure chest, as well as requiring a single small key to make progress, all before rewarding you with a sword. It's the bare basics, but it is essentially a wordless tutorial on how dungeons work, and that burden of having to teach the player ends up offloaded from Gnarled Root. So if you're tackling Seasons second, then, well, you already have enough dungeon knowledge to have gotten through ages. So this is unnecessary. The game instead starts you off with the sword, and the Hero's Cave tutorial is entirely skipped, allowing Gnarled Root to come out of the deal unmodified, regardless of which game order you choose. All of that said, I do feel it works better as a first dungeon than a 10th. As previously mentioned, in all my previous playthroughs of these games, I have done Seasons second, and as such have always found Gnarled Root to be rather unremarkable. It's not bad, it's just not great either. A mid-tier dungeon. But examining it as the first dungeon instead has made me appreciate it a lot more. For a first dungeon, it is of decent size, spanning the equivalent of 19 full-sized rooms, or 20 if you count this side-scrolling room where we get the dungeon item. I say equivalent of because some of these rooms are actually larger chambers that take up the same amount of space as 2 standard-sized rooms, but they're still registered on the dungeon map in equal-sized tiles. So essentially the map screen counts this as 2 rooms, even though looking at the actual structure during gameplay shows that it is clearly one large room. Speaking of rooms, let's talk about the architecture. Aesthetically, it's just okay. It has green brick walls and brownish floor tiles, which make for a decent, earthy color palette. It resembles Key Cavern quite a bit in the architecture. These games are, of course, built off the back of Link's Awakening DX, which is not a bad thing, mind you, but the reused assets are nothing to write home about. There's only so much you can do visually on the Game Boy Color, though, so I'm willing to cut them a lot of slack here. There are still small little touches here and there to give the dungeon some personality. They use red and blue tiles to mark important areas and provide some visual flair. When most of the dungeon has this flagstone floor pattern, a room early on that has these vibrant reds is going to stick out in my memory, which is good, since that's the critical path towards the dungeon boss, gated by a puzzle that you can't yet complete. Using the architecture itself to offer landmarks that are vital to the gameplay is great, and while Gnarled Root isn't exactly complex, including a nice visual element like that can allow even the most complicated dungeons to feel just a little more understandable at a glance, so it's good to see it included as early as this. The music, meanwhile, is pretty mediocre here. It isn't the most grating, but it isn't anywhere near as moody as something like Tail Cave's theme or the Light World dungeon theme from A Link to the Past, though it's sounds a little incidental. In some ways, it makes it feel a little like this sort of dungeon crawling is just business as usual for Link, which works for me honestly. It's just not that catchy or particularly memorable. Structurally, I guess the music can be compared to Tail Cave in that it alternates between a sort of curious section and then a dangerous sounding section. Which conceptually is perfect for dungeon music, but this one just doesn't resonate with me the same way that track did. Still, this is far from either the worst or best that this soundtrack has to offer. The second portion of the song is musically far more interesting to me than the first. And well, if it were only that first portion of the song on loop, I think I would rate this track even more critically, but that second part kind of balances it out. What I like about Gnarled Root as a starter dungeon is the way it is unafraid to wordlessly let you try things out and learn for yourself. After the foyer, the dungeon immediately branches in 3 directions, and while the north route only has a hint-giving old man, the other 2 are vital for progression, with the east path being that one that leads towards the boss, and the west route pretty well containing the rest of the dungeon. That said, you are required to at least head east first to grab the key to that western door, which will tease you with a door we can't open in this room, which I mentioned earlier with that red path. This is something the dungeon does well a couple of times, trailing you past things you can't do yet while on your way through the dungeon. In this case, these unlit torches that seasoned Zelda players will undoubtedly take a mental note of. There's some simple Zelda 1 style push block mechanisms to open doors, as well as a more complicated push block maze to get through. The dungeon spreads its keys and locked doors out quite nicely as well. There are only 2 small keys, but they're placed in areas that demand you explore thoroughly, and then are supplemented later by item gating, which is a great balance to have. Overall, the exploration here is fairly straightforward, if you're able to take note of your surroundings and use the old process of elimination effectively. This dungeon shouldn't stump you, but it's also not really meant to. We're only at the start of the game after all. It'll block you with a locked or sealed door here and there, but there will always be a second path to explore and find the means to eventually open every room. Frankly, this is a solid progression structure, making use of forks in the road, locks and keys, and explorable space very well. A neat feature that I'm surprised to see make such an early debut in this game is the set of minecart tracks found in this central area of the dungeon. These are always neat set pieces, and mechanically will transport you from a source area to a predetermined destination with a built-in switch in the tracks that you can toggle with a nearby lever to change course. It's not exactly groundbreaking stuff, but it is put to good use here, especially since you're locked into that course once you hop in. There's no getting out of the cart until it stops at the end, which adds a fun little wrinkle to the navigation in a couple of rooms. It makes it feel like pushing forward is a greater commitment. The map and compass are placed pretty well here too. The map is found pretty early on in this room. The compass, meanwhile, is tucked on this ledge, which isn't too hidden, but is potentially missable if you're being hasty. And I could totally imagine someone not spotting it until they're already in the minecart below, riding past here. The compass retains its jingle feature from Link's Awakening as well, which I'm a huge fan of, honestly. I'm not sure why this never became the standard. Maybe it's because later games would just give you the minimap instead. The map itself, meanwhile, feels far more functional in this game than Link's Awakening, being given its own dedicated map screen like most games have, rather than this corner of your inventory screen that Link's Awakening gave it. It's a small change, but it feels like such an improvement, and brings it more in line with games like A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. Of course, our path through the dungeon will ultimately take us to the northernmost room, where we'll encounter the mid-boss. This is apparently be a pair of boomerang-wielding Gorias. Though they look pretty different from the other Gorias if you ask me. These are called the Brother Gorias, and when I described them as boomerang-wielding, I do mean a singular boomerang between the two of them. They're no slouches, especially for the first mid-boss, but it's nothing unmanageable. Though the way they use formations around Link is pretty interesting, it doesn't feel challenging enough for this concept to really be realized. Oh well, defeating them will lead us towards the dungeon item, a seed satchel containing Ember Seeds, essentially Link's very own fire starter kit. Functionally, it's the same as either the candle from the original Zelda or the magic powder from Link's Awakening, allowing us to burn flammable objects and light torches. This gets put to use right away. The mid-bosses will spawn a portal, like they always did in Link's Awakening, but rather than teleporting you to the dungeon entrance, it loops you back to this room where we can try out our new equipment, lighting these torches to open this door and get the boss key. Then we can use it again in this room where we got our first small key earlier, which will take us towards the boss itself. If I'm being honest, I was a little surprised about where the portal dropped me off at first, but doing it this way makes learning to use the item feel that much more intuitive and streamlined, without them needing to lock you in the room to teach you how the item works. The seed satchel itself doesn't sound like the most exciting of dungeon items, but setting fires is fun, and it's going to be absolutely vital for the rest of the game. Plus, we also find bombs in here and can get a shield from the village before the dungeon, so it feels like the game is already starting to stack our inventory with versatile equipment early on, which I certainly don't mind. So once we've gotten our Ember Seeds and nabbed the boss key, there's one final little maze area to get through, avoiding the wall masters as we do, and we can head towards the dungeon boss. Dropping with a thud, will be halted by Aquamentus. Yeah, like that Aquamentus, marking his only ever return in the series since the original Legend of Zelda. Great to see you, Aquamentus. He looks great here. A clear carryover from his NES design, but with a great deal of added detail that makes him look far more menacing. And he actually uses both his wings and horn in this game. This is a short but pretty fun first boss, and a huge glow up for the iconic Unicorn Dragon. As he did in the original game, he will attack by launching projectiles at you, but now he will also fly to avoid your attacks and charge at you with an aggressive, impaling melee attack. There isn't any use for your newly acquired Ember Seeds here, and from my testing, he's even immune to damage from bombs, it seems. So instead, this fight requires you to focus on maintaining the correct positioning and strike his head to deal damage. He also now has some nice telegraphing before his attacks, with his horn glowing before he shoots those projectiles. Between that and the way your own sword attacks swipe instead of just being a straight stab, all of these added elements just makes the fight feel a little fairer and, for lack of better words, less spammy. It's not really that difficult, but it's a nice set piece. And, well, as I've said repeatedly, a first boss shouldn't really be that challenging. It's more about teaching players the gameplay flow and laying groundwork. But more than anything else, I'm glad that Aquamentus got a second life here in this game. He's not just this game's first boss, he is the first dungeon boss in all of Zelda. And I'm surprised that this game from 2001 was the last time we've seen him. Alas, once he's defeated, we'll find the fertile soil, the first essence of nature. And we're off. So overall, Gnarled Root is pretty average, maybe even below average as a 10th dungeon. But as a first dungeon, I think it's pretty good. It wordlessly teaches the dungeon experience to you, and the concepts that Hero's Cave introduced first get nicely reinforced to the player from its block puzzles, locks and keys, and item gating. It's not likely to stump you, but that's okay. Even with its heavier action focus, the dungeon is incredibly forgiving, with a weirdly generous amount of fairies that can spawn in to heal you. While it isn't necessarily the prettiest dungeon to look at, it gets by just fine, and is just mechanically interesting enough, and laid out smartly enough, to check off pretty well all of my boxes. The enemy variety is good here too. We've got Voles, Scoria, Blade Traps, Stalfos, Keese, and even Wallmasters. Though good enemy variety is something that 2D Zelda rarely struggles with. The game's action focus is immediately noticeable here, and there are even some spots where I was surprised that my hearts started to get close to depletion. All that said, I think we need to address the elephant in the room, or more accurately, the eagle in the room, or perhaps even more accurately, the rooms in the eagle. Okay, so what I'm getting at here is that at some point during development of the Oracle games, a full Game Boy Color remake of Zelda 1 was in the works, but ultimately scrapped. But traces of that remake can be seen here and there, little elements that harken back to the original Zelda, one of those being this dungeon. This is the map of Gnarled Root Dungeon, and this is the map of Zelda 1's first dungeon, the Eagle. Even their dungeon entrances are pretty similar, a hollow tree on a lone island with a bridge extending east. Both of these dungeons feature Aquamentus as the boss, and he's even found in the exact same spot. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot here that allows Gnarled Root to stand out on its own, enough for me to feel it is distinct from the Eagle, which didn't have ember seeds, minecarts, torch puzzles, or even any rooms that weren't of uniform size. But the parts that are similar are eerily so. Though the room sizes got weirdly increased for no discernible reason, and in most cases I don't think that sheer size adds to the gameplay in any meaningful way. None of that necessarily detracts from what is here though, and I think that for what it is, that Gnarled Root Dungeon works pretty well. There's a familiarity to it that is sort of comfy to me, but also enough branching paths to get me to look around carefully and take note of my surroundings. If this came any later in the game, I would be a lot harder on it, but placed right here at the start of seasons, having to either get the action going or at the very least reignite it, I think Gnarled Root does the job pretty elegantly. Thank you so much for watching. Special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon, the names of which you're seeing on screen right now. You all are awesome. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.